Hi, welcome. My name is Duran. I am a program manager with the Climate Center, and I'm happy to welcome you to this webinar. I'm going to do a quick little introduction before I turn it over to our first speaker, who's going to be Ellie Cohen from the Climate Center, at which point we're going to then move on to our esteemed panel. So once again, my name is Duran. Welcome to the third in our series of webinars on investing in climate action for jobs, health, and equity. This is a series of webinars, and today we'll be discussing investing in sustainable mobility. Please make a note that we have some more exciting webinars coming up. On February 24th, we'll be discussing investing in workers for a world beyond fossil fuels, another topic that we're very excited about. And I'm going to ask my colleague Nina to drop a link in the chat. You will be meeting Nina a little bit later during our Take Action item. So if you hear me referencing her, you'll get a chance to meet her soon. And we're going to have additional webinars in 2022 covering community energy resilience, building electrification, and more. And I want to let you all know to save the date for our Climate Policy Summit, which is going to be on Monday, April 18th in person at Sacramento State. We're going to Sacramento and we're going to meet in person. Of course, there are contingencies if there's another wave of infections, but our plan right now is to gather in Sacramento on Monday, April 18th, and have a lobby day the day after. I'm going to ask Nina to drop a link to that also. Of course, this being an in-person event with food and drink, there is a cost associated, but we hope you all can join us there in Sacramento for that exciting policy summit. Of course, none of this would be possible without our many sponsors and supporters. So I want to thank all of our sponsors: River City Bank, Y-Green, Recology Summit, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, who's here with us today, LA Department of Water and Power, Blue Planet Energy, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, MCE, Terra Verde, and Peninsula Clean Energy. And I think you can see from the range of organizations and companies how broad the coalition is that's promoting Climate Safe California and that is here today to be with you. Our promotional partners, I especially want to shout out to Move LA and Denny Zane and his team, who did a great job helping spread the word. And of course, all of these other nonprofits who are part of our broad and powerful coalition of change makers. We'd like to invite you to join those organizations and businesses. You can sponsor, you can help promote, you can be part of our team in a variety of ways. To find out more about all of that, just go to theclimatecenter.org, or you can email me. My email address is in my signature there, duran@theclimatecenter.org. And in order to keep us moving, I'm very excited now to turn the mic over to my colleague, our CEO, Ellie Cohen, who's going to tell you a little bit more about why we're here. Ellie?
Great. Thank you so much, Duran. And it's an honor to be here today with such an esteemed panel. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to introduce our Climate Safe California campaign and launch our webinar today. Just want to remind everybody that the current climate goals really are inadequate for the we face. The UN IPCC 1.5C report from October of 2018 is the basis for most of the legislation and lawmaking going on around the world today. It calls for essentially cutting emissions in half by 2030 and removing upwards of 1 trillion tons of climate pollution from the atmosphere to get to net zero emissions by 2050 and staying under 1.5C warming in the industrial era. The problem is the latest science is showing this isn't enough, and the UN operates by consensus. So as bold as this seems, this is still pretty conservative and not enough. After the latest UN IPCC report, the sixth assessment, came out in August, the UN Secretary General called it Code Red for humanity. This report must sound a death knell for coal and fossil fuels before they destroy our planet. And we've experienced in the past 8 months extremes that global climate models don't include, these regional extremes that are truly off the charts. And we can expect to experience more and more of those if we don't dramatically cut emissions and start drawdown very soon. No temperature rise is safe. This is from medical experts across the world who did a joint journal editorial that rapidly warming climate is the greatest threat to global public health. And another study, actually a series of studies have come out showing that we will pass the 1.5C threshold much sooner than the United Nations have projected by 2030, and some are now saying as early as 2027, with dire consequences for us in California in terms of the ability to grow crops, water availability, health issues, and much more. And also economically, climate inaction and that or delay is bankrupting our economy. There are all sorts of efforts, just nascent, starting to address this. The Federal Reserve has required now that banks consider climate risks. We know there are threats to the insurance and mortgage markets, pension funds, and other institutions. And we know that the cost of inaction is enormous. The 2018 fires in California alone are estimated to have cost $150 billion, really more than half of our current budget this year for the state. And $80 billion in 2019, which if invested in jobs can generate hundreds of thousands. And we know that investments in clean energy generate more than twice the jobs as in fossil fuels. The nation and the world are looking to California to lead for a climate safe future. We've fallen behind, but we can do much more and retake our leadership. We know we need more aggressive, equitable policies and accelerated timelines for action. Our Climate Safe California campaign calls for, by 2025, that California will have enacted the bold policies required by science to dramatically cut emissions, start drawdown, and secure resilient communities for everyone by 2030, inspiring global action. In essence, what we're really saying is that 2045 is too late to get to carbon neutrality and then net negative emissions. We want to move that up to 2030, which means to getting somewhere around 80% below 1990 levels by 2030, and using nature-based sequestration on a much greater level than we're doing right now so that we can get to net negative by 2030. These are all doable. We have the technology and the know-how to do it. We really need the political will. Our guiding principles for our work, it's got to be based on the latest science and observations, ensure a just transition for fossil fuel workers, their families and communities, and prioritize climate justice and ensure that lower income communities and communities of color are no longer disproportionately harmed. And the kinds of policies, 4 legs really: accelerating the phase out of fossil fuels, scaling up nature-based sequestration, investing in community resilience, and funding climate action. Today, we're focusing on this first: accelerating the phase out of fossil fuel production, electrifying transportation and buildings, and on rapidly transitioning to sustainable mobility. The kinds of policies we're looking for: we need to phase out fossil fuel powered vehicles immediately. Cash for Clunkers programs helps to do that. We're beginning to phase in electric vehicles in all these sectors. We think that no new gas powered vehicle registrations needs to be moved up, not just 2035, but by 2030. And there's some scientists who are calling for it even as early as 2028. And we need to flip priorities, invest 80% of Caltrans money into non-greenhouse gas producing sustainable modes of transportation, invest in affordable housing near jobs, and invest in clean mass transit. One great example is what's starting to happen with electric school buses. We can scale this up. If we have all of our school buses in California electric, we will store 1/4 of the peak electricity usage. We will help clean the air, and we can provide power through outages. We can solve multiple challenges with the same investment. And the governor just announced in his new budget, $1.5 billion just for this. It's a great solution. The governor also last summer, thanks to our work on Climate Safe California, ordered the Air Resources Board to evaluate pathways to carbon neutrality by 2035, 10 years ahead of current policy, but we still need more. I invite you today to endorse Climate Safe California at climatesafeca.org or our website, theclimatecenter.org. Thank you so much. I'll turn it back to Duran.
Thank you, Ellie. It's a great presentation. Thank you for setting some context for all the incredible speakers that we have here today. I want to let you all know we're going to be doing a couple of Q&A sessions, one after our first 2 speakers, who are going to be Assemblymember Friedman and Professor Dan Sperling. And then we'll do another Q&A session towards the end with the rest of our speakers. So all of you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and we will be sure to sort through those. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Assemblymember Laura Friedman. Rather than take time with lengthy introductions, I'm going to ask my colleague Nina to drop your bios in the chat. And at this point, I'm just going to say Assemblymember Friedman is a leader on this issue of mobility, as well as many others. We're proud to have you with us here today. Assemblymember Friedman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for not reading the bio. Somehow I always find that a little bit embarrassing. But it is really wonderful to be able to be here with all of you. And I really appreciate your inviting me to spend a little time. And I absolutely appreciate seeing so many people participating today and being interested in this very important subject. It's been a big year for the Assembly Transportation Committee. I came to chair this committee just about a year ago. I had been chairing the Natural Resources Committee in the Assembly. And I loved chairing natural resources, let me say. In natural resources, I got to focus on our open space, on CEQA, on clean energy, oil and gas, lots of areas that I care a lot about. But when I looked at the impact of different sectors on greenhouse gas emissions and on climate change, I kept coming back to transportation and what an outsized role transportation has been playing in emissions portfolio. And I'm sorry, I don't know why my camera keeps turning itself off. It's a little bit weird, but I'll try to keep an eye on it. It seems to have a mind of its own. So I decided to move over to transportation when the opportunity came up to try to change the way that we've been thinking about transportation policy in California. And I'll get to that more in a little bit. But so far, it's been a pretty big year, and last year was a big year for the Transportation Committee. And I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish, working, of course, with our leadership with Anthony Rendon and with our governor, Gavin Newsom, who is a visionary when it comes to climate and has been doing an incredible job, I think, of centering climate and environmental policies in everything that he does. And his budget, is definitely a statement of those values. And it's a statement of our values as a legislature in California and how much of that budget has a focus on climate and emissions and sustainability. So you all know that transportation accounts for somewhere around 50% of California's annual greenhouse gas emissions. And I think around the world, there's a growing recognition of the outsized role that transportation and mobility plays, with some countries, of course, having less of an impact from single occupancy vehicles and others having a lot more. And I was very proud this year to have been able to go to Scotland to participate in the climate change conference at the COPE. And there, transportation was absolutely a huge focus of conversation. And a lot of the new technologies that were being discussed were involving transportation. So the world has started to recognize that we can work on our energy production portfolio. And in some ways, I think that's almost easier to do. But transportation is difficult, and it's a difficult sector to decarbonize. And I'm glad you're going to be talking about buildings soon, because that's another area I've worked quite a bit in, and another difficult area, but one that we have to start discussing. So recent years in California, we've seen a historic investment in clean transportation. Last year's budget allocated almost $4 billion over 3 years to reduce emissions in the sector. And the 2022-23 budget, there it goes again, budget proposes $6.1 billion, that's billion with a B, for ZEV acceleration. And that's a huge, huge statement from California about our seriousness of moving towards ZEVs. And the governor's executive order about ending the sale of gasoline-powered automobiles in California was definitely felt around the world. And when I was at the COP, I had several representatives from different countries tell me how meaningful that was to their country and to their goals. People all around the world and see that as being a hugely, hugely serious. If anybody out there knows why my camera keeps turning off, please tell me, because it's very annoying. And I apologize again for that. So the 6.1 billion will go to clean cars, clean trucks, and buses for infrastructure programs and ongoing funding to ensure that low-income Californians can afford to own and purchase a clean car. And I think that equity piece of it is so important because, of course, in lower income communities, not only have we not seen the adoption of clean cars that we'd like to see, but a lot of times those communities end up with more polluting cars because they have older model automobiles. So you get even more bang for your buck when you help incentivize programs in those communities to transfer those automobiles into a newer generation of cleaner vehicles. This also includes spending on the infrastructure necessary to support all classes of ZEVs, light, medium, and heavy duty. And I'll just say that one of the interesting battles that we're seeing right now is over funding being allocated to electric infrastructure versus hydrogen infrastructure. And so I personally think it's wonderful that we have dueling clean technologies. I think the more the better. And I do think that we'll find that some of those technologies work better in different spaces in the short term, but I agree that we need to have investments in all kinds of ZEVs that make sense, particularly when it comes to our heavy duty sector, which I think that there's probably a larger role for hydrogen to play. Now, $900 million is going to expand affordability and convenient ZEV infrastructure access in low-income communities, helping to answer, of course, that equity piece and expressing our values that we don't want anybody left behind. And we want to make sure that opportunities are available to everybody across our communities. And I also hope that CARB and that our local municipalities work with all sectors of their communities to make sure that people understand what opportunities are available out there, both in terms of personal vehicles, but also with infrastructure. CARB is working on regulations to achieve 100% clean passenger vehicle sales by 2035 based on the governor's executive order. And I, along with other legislators, are encouraging them to accelerate the early interim targets to ensure that California achieves our environmental goals and remains a leader in this space. These investments are critical in reaching our climate goals while ZEVs still promote single occupancy modes of transportation. This is a step in the right direction. But I also want to caution that putting all of our eggs in the ZEV basket is not going to be enough, because even if we somehow magically overnight turned every single occupancy car into, we still have climate impacts from single occupancy vehicles. And we have land use impacts, we have congestion impacts, public safety impacts. So while ZEVs are important, they cannot be our only focus. And I think it bears repeating, because if we continue to think that ZEVs are going to solve all of our climate problems, we're going to end up falling way short. We need to also invest in vehicle alternatives, being active transportation and transit. We also, and I'm going to come back to this later, but I also think that we need to focus on the intersectionality between modes of transit and land use, housing, climate, equity. We need to put all of those together in the public's mind, because we have siloed those issues so long. They're in different committees in the legislature. People think of them in terms of different buckets, but they all have to work together if we're going to achieve our climate goals and also our public health goals. And I just think that we always need to be mindful of that these are the different facets of the same topic. So our active transportation program, which funds projects for bikes, for walking infrastructure, and for smart land use choices, has a backlog of nearly $2 billion in projects that are ready to move forward. Since its inception in 2013, the Active Transportation Program has funded over 800 projects across the state. 400 of those are Safe Routes to Schools project, very, very important. Almost 90% of the funding benefits disadvantaged communities, also critical. And just 11% of applications were funded in the last cycle. So there's a lot of pent-up demand out there, and we have left millions of dollars worth of high quality, ready to go projects on the table that will provide good jobs for workers as well. Now, my colleague, I think I'm being given am I being told that I have to start wrapping up? Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. Well, let's just say that I want to get a lot more money into active transportation. I didn't even get to the transit needs, but transit has been incredibly challenged because of COVID. In some ways, we need to reimagine some of that transit. In some ways, we need to give them the funding bridge to get them through the COVID crisis. Hopefully it will wind itself down at some point, but we need to get people into transit. We need to invest in transit. We need to connect all of these thoughts with how we use land so that people can live closer to where they work and closer to amenities, and so that we get people out of cars, get them walking, biking, and taking transit. I'm doing a lot of legislation in this area, and I continue to try to make that holistic approach my focus in the Transportation Committee to find ways of decentering funding just roads, unless we're doing road work for active transportation as well, and to make sure that we look at everything through a climate lens. And with that, I'll stop. And I'm sorry I only got 1 page into my 5 pages of notes because I talked so much. But thanks again for having me. You can tell how excited I am about the topic.
Well, thank you so much, Assembly Member. And yes, I think we could all speak for hours on this important topic. We will be able to come back during the Q&A session, and I see folks are dropping questions into the Q&A. That session is going to happen after our next speaker, who I am proud to introduce from UC Davis, and also who sits on the California Air Resources Board. And again, Dan, your bio will be included in a link. So if you want to learn more about Dan Sperling, please click on that link. In the meantime, I'll turn the rest of the time over to you. Thank you for being here, Professor Sperling. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Doran. Thank you so much. This is really a pleasure to be part of this. I've spent my whole career in transportation, and actually, finally, after decades, there's a lot of interest in it. And a lot, as Assemblymember Friedman said, this is really the core issue for us in California to decarbonize. Transportation accounts for just about half of all the greenhouse gases in California. It's a somewhat lower percentage elsewhere, but it's really a big part of it. It's the biggest sector in the US for sure. So let me say that looking at it from a California perspective, California's role is so hugely important. The rest of the world does look to California for its leadership. California is a leader, it is a model. And so what we do really is important way beyond our borders. I just was on a call this morning with the European Union and people, and I'm going to show in a moment, they're doing a lot of great things in Europe, but they look to California also for a lot of the initiatives that we're pursuing. So the number one for transportation, the number one strategy by far to achieve decarbonization, to get to net zero, is zero emission vehicles. And when I say zero emission vehicles, it's of course battery electric vehicles, but there's going to be an important role for hydrogen vehicles and even for plug-in hybrid vehicles that might have a small combustion engine. And I'm going to get into why that's important in a moment. The good news is that the automotive industry, and that's both trucks and cars, is well positioned. It's well on its way to this transition to zero emission vehicles. They're on board. It's the question of how fast they're willing to go. Some more willing to go faster, some not so fast. What we've learned in California and Europe and China is that the regulatory instruments, the regulatory push is so key to making this happen. It's the signal that these regulations send. If we say we're going to 100% ZEVs, that really sends a signal through the whole economy, through industry. It aligns everyone to start thinking about all the different things that need to be done, because just even doing zero emission vehicles, even if the companies were committed to manufacturing 100% tomorrow, it won't happen. There's so much, there's the infrastructure, there's all the permitting that has to happen at the local government level, there's the fleets, there's a lot of things that have to happen to make it, to actually get to this future. So the good news is not only the industry is on track, but in California, we really have just about all the policies we need. We have to tighten up a few of them, but we have in California the most sophisticated and comprehensive set of climate policies for the transportation sector of any region in the world. We have policies and regulations for the infrastructure, for the vehicle, for cars, trucks, buses. We have the low carbon fuel standard. We are dealing with reducing vehicle use, and we're dealing with equity, and perhaps not as effectively as we could, but we are definitely doing that. So I want to show, though, having said all this, I've got a slide here that I want to show. So California is a leader in policy, but it's no longer a leader in investment and action. And here you see what's been happening the last few years with zero emission vehicles. And what you see is that California, so here I just have North America, but what you see is China now is they're selling 6 million electric vehicles this coming year. It was about 3 or 4 million this past year. They're ramping up. China is already 15% market share. All of their light duty vehicles, 15% are ZEVs. And that's for a huge market. The Chinese market is the biggest car market in the world. And so they're at just about 15% market share. Europe, which had been lagging, is now surpassing California, surpassing the US by far. Europe is already now at about 15% market share also, and increasing their market share at a very steep rate. Germany is at about 25%. There are even extreme situations like Norway, which is over 75%. And so in terms of actual action, we are starting to lag behind. The good news is that's going to change, because of these regulations and policies. The governor's executive order that ordered CARB to move ahead. CARB now is, in June, will be adopting a regulation that we get to about, or is probably, I can't say I'm voting for it, we'll be getting to 100% ZEVs for the light duty market by 2035. We've already adopted, CARB has already adopted rules for trucks that would get to about 70% market share by 2035, and is in the process of actually tightening up those regs to make it even more aggressive. That truck regulation is far ahead of anyone else in the world, any other region in the world. And that includes actually Europe and China. So California is leading in terms of the transition to ZEV trucks, certainly on the policy side. Now, I want to make a point, Assemblymember Friedman and many others say transportation is the hardest sector to decarbonize. And that's something we always used to say. But what's happening now is that storyline is no longer correct. Because battery costs have come down so much, because there's been so much learning on how to make zero emission vehicles, the reality is that within a few years, it will be cheaper to own and operate a zero emission vehicle than a combustion vehicle. And I'm talking about not just cars, but even the medium duty and heavy duty trucks as well. So this is a study that we did at the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies for the state of California last year. And we found that around 2030 or so, the total cost of owning and operating vehicles will be less for zero emission vehicles than for combustion vehicles. So the point of this is that this makes sense economically as well as environmentally. And from an investment perspective, there is this hump over the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And we do need to make some major investments that Assemblymember Friedman was talking about. And so far, I'm just talking about vehicles. I'm going to extend it beyond that in a moment. But we do need the investment for the charging infrastructure. We need the incentives for people to buy these vehicles, for companies to buy them, because the costs are higher initially. So, this message that this is not so hard, actually, and makes economic sense, is a really important one. And I think it's one that we should be, it's a message we should be sending more broadly and more assertively. Now, okay, that was all in vehicles. And vehicles, cars, trucks, and buses are by far the most important strategy. Whoops, I just see I'm running out of time too. Okay, so I want to make two last big points. One is sustainable transportation. We have created a car-centric transportation system. We pioneered it in LA and California. It spread to the rest of the world. That car-centric transportation marginalizes much of our population. Depending on how you count it, 15 to 20% people that are physically disabled, low income, young, elderly. And so, yes, zero emission vehicles are the #1 strategy, but we need to make a much better transportation system. We need to use our vehicles better. We need to bring in those bicycles and scooters. You see behind me, my favorite zero emission vehicle, my bicycle. And so we need to make it easier, more comfortable and secure for people to use bicycles and scooters. We need micro transit. We need to take some of the ideas that principles that Uber and Lyft have developed and use them for smaller vehicles. There's a company, Via, that does that. And we got to link it all together with transit. We need to rethink transit, and we can't just be throwing money at transit. We need to rethink how to integrate all these modes together in a much better way. That's not much part of the policy agenda that should be. And it, of course, and it links, as Assemblymember Friedman said, to land use and transit. And I have to mention freight. I don't have time to get into it, but yes, we're going to electrify and use hydrogen for our trucks, but there's so much more to it. It's the ports, it's the supply chains, it's the warehouses and distribution centers, it's this proliferation of local delivery and all the trucks. We need less truck vehicle miles traveled, vehicle use, and we can do it. And the last major point I want to make is just about all of this has to be socially sustainable. We've got this car-centric transportation system, and we need to move beyond that. And in that way, it will be responsive to concerns about environmental justice, social justice. We need to provide more accessibility and more mobility to those large groups of people that don't have access to cars or don't have easy access to cars or access to reliable vehicles. We need to provide better accessibility and mobility for a lot of communities and a lot of people. And we also need to, for a lot of communities, we're disrupting them with the warehouses and distribution centers that are proliferating everywhere because you and I want, okay, not me, but most of us want our deliveries in 2 hours or within a day. And that's what's leading to the proliferation of warehouses and distribution centers, the trucks that are swarming through our neighborhoods. And it's especially disruptive and especially dangerous and especially high pollution for a lot of the low income and disadvantaged communities that are underserved, overburdened. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Sperling. We appreciate it. And thank you for condensing your remarks. I know we all have a lot that we could be saying, and I see the Assembly member is wrangling her camera. Thank you. Thank you, Assembly member. You look good. Let's continue this conversation. We have a ton of questions from our audience. I want to thank everybody who's been dropping questions into the Q&A and the chat. We'll do our best to answer the ones we can. I'd like to start with you, Assemblymember Friedman. We have several questions, one from Linda Hutchins-Knowles, one from Susanna Saunders, addressing the issue of multi-unit housing in regard to electric vehicles. There's a push to ensure new apartments and condos provide EV-ready parking. Suzanne says we can't transition to 100% ZEV without addressing the 36% of California residents who live in apartments and condos. So can you talk about what's happening at the state right now to accelerate the availability of electric vehicle charging for folks who live in apartments and condominiums?
So there's a lot of talk about how to address this. Do you give more incentives to apartment owners to putting charging? Do you require charging in new buildings? Something that I explored back when I was on the Glendale City Council is trying to find a way to incentivize apartment building developers to put in a shared vehicle so that not everybody has to own their own car or to own two of their own cars, which is another way of thinking about reducing the use of internal combustion engines. Do we try to invest in shared parking in dense neighborhoods that is disentangled from individual apartment buildings? I think that we need to explore all of that. Some of it's going to have to do with the local communities themselves, but it's definitely one of the biggest issues to getting electric vehicles in urban areas. So I think that these are things that we're going to have to continue to explore. I know that I've heard that, anecdotally, that some residents who want to buy electric vehicles are told by the apartment owners that they have to pay large fees to be able to charge them in the building. I've heard apartment owners complain that they don't have the electric capacity in their buildings to charge a multitude of vehicles. So I think a lot of these discussions really need to begin right in the communities. I think for us sitting up in Sacramento in a building, it's hard for us to understand what all of the barriers are. So I would love to work with CARB, to work with the Apartment Owners Association, to start some focus groups to talk to tenants and to the apartment owners to see what they're thinking, what the barriers are, what the opportunities are, and what it would take to get charging in these buildings. But it's absolutely been a focus of discussion here in Sacramento. And I know even beyond that, to vehicle manufacturers are also trying to figure out how they can overcome this to sell more cars in these communities.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for addressing that. And of course, just a context, ZEVs are part, but not all of the solution. But sticking with zero emission vehicles, a lot of the questions are in those areas. I'd like to pitch one to you, Professor Sperling. This comes from Community Design, essentially pointing out that despite the availability of incentives and rebates, the upfront cost of an electric car is still often more than the upfront cost of a gasoline car. Of course, you and I know with fuel costs and maintenance and everything over the life of the vehicle, you're going to save a ton of money driving an electric vehicle, but nevertheless, that remains a barrier. Has there been any research done on where's the tipping point? What's the price point that is really going to drive sort of gas cars into extinction? Or do we just need to wait for the ban to come into effect? Or will the market perhaps take care of it even sooner than the governor's projections?
I'm a very optimistic guy. And, we often think about it, people talk about a tipping point. And I think in this case, that's probably not a good way to think about it. We do, I think the first 50, 60% of the market is going to be relatively easy, if we do build out the charging infrastructure and provide incentives. But there gets to a point where there's a lot of people that just, like in the apartments, there are people that live that it's just not going to be convenient. There's going to be a lot of other situations where it just doesn't work well for people. And so we're going to have to get creative. And, that's why hydrogen is could play a role for some of these light duty vehicles, because, that's basically you fuel it up just like a gasoline vehicle at station. We don't have the charging issues. It might be plug-in hybrids need to play a more extended role going forward. And we have a big research initiative at UC Davis so I run an Institute of Transportation Studies, and we have a big center on electric vehicles, and we're addressing all of these. So actually I would offer up our assistance. We work closely with the state, with CARB, with the Energy Commission, and many others. And we're, actually we were going to have a meeting with Assembly Member Friedman soon about this as well. And so I make that offer because there is a lot new analysis needed, and it's going to be a lot harder than we think to get to that 100%. We can wave our hands in Sacramento, as you were saying, and say, okay, everyone has to buy one. That's not how the real world works.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question, and this is actually a question that relates to both of you. Hold on a second. Let me just make sure I've got that question in front of me. There was discussion. Hold on a second here. I'm sorry. Assemblymember Friedman, you mentioned you'd like to see CARB develop a stronger ACC2 rule, and perhaps you could explain that acronym for us. Curious, Dan, as a member of CARB, do you support that? I just thought this would just be an interesting place for the two of you to perhaps comment, and maybe any final thoughts about, how do we turn California from sort of a hotbed of freeway and driving into something a little bit more in line with the vision that we're sharing here today. Assemblymember Friedman, would you like to make any closing remarks? And if you want to address the ACC2 rule, that would be fine.
Well, I was reading the chat, and there's such great ideas and great energy in the chat that I've been just sitting here taking notes on a lot of the suggestions people made. So thank you for those, everybody, and keep them coming. And feel free always to reach out to me or my office if you have ideas. We are always looking to see how we can do more and do better in this space. I think I would say that I still see far too much infrastructure that's built that's openly hostile to pedestrians or to cycling. Clearly our engineers have been taught to prioritize the free flow of automobiles and not thinking about what the everyday experience is like to somebody who's trying to navigate through that same infrastructure on foot. It's a little bit better by bicycle in many ways, but as somebody who walks a lot, there are times when to walk safely, I'm being asked to go way out of my way, to walk much further distances to find a safe place to cross the street, for instance, or have to travel across infrastructure that is feels dangerous because of the amount of speeding cars, certainly unpleasant. And we need to make people who are building these have to walk them and use them from every perspective of every type of user. And I'm still not seeing enough focus on thinking about the everyday experience for all users of the road. So that's something that if I had a magic wand, I would change in the minds of people that are maintaining and upgrading and building all of this infrastructure. And then I would say that I totally agree with Dan that we leave people behind if we just focus on passenger automobiles. Now, it's true that in many areas, if you're in a rural area, a suburban area, you're really forced to use a car to get most places. And in some of those areas, we're going to have other solutions. It's going to have to be, again, focusing on the ZEBs, but also can we rethink what transit looks like in some of these communities? What are the opportunities of automated vehicles eventually to help provide a better and more equitable mobility so that people aren't forced to purchase and insure their own automobile? But also, how do we use land better so that we don't have the kind of sprawl that makes transit almost impossible to operate? And that's why you can't think about transit and transportation without land use, because if we build in a way where you're forced to use a car, then of course people are going to always say, but I absolutely need to have my own car. But we've got plenty of examples around the world of density that is amazingly wonderful to live in, that supports people using public transportation, that supports active transportation. And by the way, gives people a better quality of life. It doesn't have to be a trade-off where you give something up to live this way. I would say that the cities that most of us want to visit in Europe are cities like this, where you want to walk around. And by the way, the side effect of that is not just about emissions. It's also about seeing your neighbor eye to eye and interacting with your community in a human scale and in a way that gives you connections to other people. It's also about the public health benefit of having people have a more active lifestyle because they're used to walking places. It's unbelievable to me when I am with people from California and they go to visit New York and they want to drive a couple of blocks. No, you can have a type of life where you time in having some ability to walk places. And by the way, you'll be healthier in the end because of it. So I think that we need to reimagine the way we live in California, and not because we're giving something up, but because we can live better and live healthier and live more equitably. And I guess I'd leave it at that if it was supposed to be my closing comments.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And Professor Sperling, any final thoughts?
Yeah, let me reaffirm part of that. It's rethinking our transportation. So you see behind me, as I said, this is my favorite zero emission vehicle, my bike. And, it's like, if you go to, like in my community in Davis, and okay, Davis is a college town and so on, but we have about a 30 to 40% market share, mode share for bike use. And I go to Los Angeles and there's almost no one using bikes. And yet Los Angeles, Southern California, San Diego, it's like the ideal place in the world for bicycles. The weather is great. It's relatively flat. It's perfect. And yet it's got almost no infrastructure. And I know Hassan Agrada is going to talk a little bit about this because he's been doing a great job. He did it in LA and San Diego. But that kind of rethinking, and so I'm delighted that Assemblymember Friedman makes this a priority for active transport, but it's like a really steep uphill battle to really make a big difference. And Doran, I'll just respond to your thing. You had a question about ACC2, which is really the zero emission vehicle mandate for California. And we CARB are going to be adopting something that looks like about 100% in 2035. And I know some people, including your organization, think we do it faster. I don't think that's doable. It's California. I want to emphasize, California is a model and a leader. If we say we're going to 100% in 2035, that has huge impact. If you said 2030, okay, that would have huge impact too. But we want to do this in a way that's not too disruptive. As I said, we depend on the car companies to be able, to scale up, to sell these vehicles at a competitive price. And the cost is coming down, the battery cost is coming down. You can push it only so far. And as I showed, Europe and China are moving aggressively forward. And I think they're pretty much on this path of 100% in 2035. I think we've come to appreciate that's probably the sweet spot. And we can do something like that for trucks. That's almost as important. And we're on that path. That's where California is leading the world. And I think that's really important. So I have lots of other things I could say because, I guess the only other thing I'd say with Assemblymember Friedman, we need to really rethink transportation, and actually automated vehicles might be the entry point to do that, because that is a way that we can provide more accessibility to more people. But the only way that's going to work is if those automated vehicles are used as mobility service companies, that they're used, that are not personally owned. So if I would say anything to the legislators, they should be really thinking about how to create the incentives and the rules to make sure that these automated vehicles are shared use vehicles, that they're not personally owned, or at least not many of them are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sperling, and thank you so much, Assemblymember Friedman. I want to thank you both for sharing both your vision and sort of your practical analysis of what is possible. We believe in pushing things fast because the climate crisis demands it. We're actually going to have an action item on this specific topic a little bit later. But I'd like to turn now to our next panel. And Professor Sperling, if you'd like to answer any questions in the Q&A, you're welcome to do that. Assemblymember Friedman also. I thank you all for all of your engagement. But our next panel is going to include Adrian Martinez from Earth Justice, then Hassan Ikrada from Sandag, and Minda Berbeco from the Air District here in the Bay Area. So first, I'd like to turn to Adrian, talking a little bit about the equitable movement of goods and people. It's not just about cars, right, Adrian?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Adrian Martinez, and I'm an attorney with Earth Justice. I'm in our Right to Zero campaign, which is focusing on getting to zero emissions in transportation, energy, and our buildings. I'm going to focus a little bit on goods movement. I know there's a lot of interest in passenger transport, so whether that's bus, bike, walking, or cars, but I think the goods movement industry is an important opportunity given its size in California and given that it's been basically set up in a land use manner that provides the brunt of the harm to our disadvantaged communities. So a couple thoughts. We're now on the precipice of immense amount of resources going to clean up the freight and goods movement industry. The governor's proposed budget has billions of dollars for trucks, locomotives, aviation, all sorts of kind of components of this system. But I think on the flip side, there's also a lot of money for just plain expansion of the system. And so I think one of the things from an investment standpoint, we need to kind of shift is we need to kind of marry those two parts of it. Investments in the infrastructure piece, so the expansion needs to be zero emission investments. We can't think of it as we're going to expand the system and then down the road we're going to pay the industry to clean up that equipment. It just doesn't make any sense. We're making the problem worse. And I think goods movement is a nice place to focus from an equity standpoint, as I mentioned, because of how our system has been set up. Several communities up and down the state suffer from high pollution levels from our ports, rail yards, highways, airports, and warehouses. And so investments in zero emission goods movement can go a long way in providing relief to communities that have suffered from decades of harm. And I think that's kind of one of the pieces, I think we need to figure out is how do we get the Caltrans and the California Transportation Commission to more fully integrate those considerations into their decisions. Now, there have been some very positive movements. A good example in Southern California was the I-710 South expansion. This is a project that was going to expand a roadway to facilitate more trucks on the I-710, which is a major artery going from our ports to the rail yards and then ultimately out to the rest of the country. And, the planners wanted to focus on a combustion-oriented project for a long time, and advocates spent 20 years fighting that, saying it just doesn't make sense. You can't claim you're going to improve air quality in the region by stuffing more diesel trucks through a community. And so it took 20 years, tens of thousands of hours of time from grassroots community groups, environmental groups and whatnot, to kind of basically get our agencies to see what the actual science and what was right. And so I think that's one thing is we need to kind of do less of that, because it puts community groups and environmental groups and other groups kind of more in the mode of fighting and having to allocate a lot of resources trying to steer the course away from these just very frustrating and terrible projects. Now we're in a place where I think our agencies are trying to do this more. I think it still needs to permeate a little bit more throughout the agency. But as we're investing in projects, we need to force the ports, the rail yards, the other parts of the industry to incorporate the zero emissions on the front end. It needs to be part of the project, not just on incentive programs to clean up the equipment on the back end. So I think that's a critical piece that we need to kind of really start pushing at all levels. The other thing I want to kind of, reference, and I was pleased at the debate up front where we're talking about hydrogen versus electric. And the reason I'm pleased is I feel like, especially in Southern California, natural gas transportation has sucked up a lot of the attention. They have some very good lobbyists to make any debate about heavy duty transportation or goods movement into that issue. So it's nice that we're debating electric versus hydrogen. I think those are important debates to have. And I think that's where we want to be. We kind of need to move away from combustion of these fuels like natural gas and diesel, because I think in the freight sector, really what we're seeing from air planners, from companies, from environmental justice groups have been clear from the beginning, and environmental groups is the general consensus on the need to move to zero emissions as much as possible. Now, what this looks like, I think one of the things that's hard is we still are seeing a lot of legacy decisions that we need to change. We need to stop these kind of decisions that invest in combustion and make things worse. So I want to give one example in the movement of goods that I think is particularly relevant to today, and hopefully something that folks on this call and others can kind of help take action on. And so I'm going to talk about something that's more national, and And I think it's a good example of the kind of different way of thinking that we need to undergo to advance equity and advance more sustainable investment. And so that's the United States Service. So the United States Postal Service is on the precipice of one of the largest vehicle contracts in history. It's a vehicle contract to replace up to 165,000 of its vehicles. These are the little delivery trucks that everyone knows that go through virtually every neighborhood in the country. And so the federal government has a unique opportunity to bring zero emission electric transport to basically every neighborhood in the country. And right now, the Postal Service is proposing to invest 90% in combustion vehicles and 10% in battery electric vehicles. In our world, we often talk about kind of low-hanging fruit. This is fruit that, or strategies to clean the air or climate that are easier than others, they're low. I think when you talk about a postal vehicle, it's not low-hanging fruit. This is fruit that's falling off the tree and it's on the ground right now. These are vehicles that go short distance, approximately average 20 miles per day. They idle a lot as they're delivering, and then they're generally housed at night in some sort of depot. So this is the type of vehicle that's primed for electrification. Instead of doing a combustion vehicle, which has worse fuel economy than an F-150 and many other kind of types of vehicles. So, one of the problems is the agency in charge is the Postal Service. But, I think this is the type of thing where these are the types of contracts we need to shift. If you look at, these are the types of vehicles that will be on the road till 2050, 2060, given how the Postal Service generally runs their vehicles. So this is a federal example. We have examples in California on the smaller scale, but we need to really start shifting this purchasing decisions, these decisions on infrastructure to move away from combustion. And the final thing I'll say on this is, from the advocate standpoint and my clients and partners that I work with, we're not saying this is gonna be easy. This is inherently going to be hard, but it's not, as Professor Sperling said, it's not as hard as I think people thought, especially in some of these early sectors like delivery vans and other things like that. So I think it's something we really need to kind of roll up our sleeves and push on this. And then on the kind of more personal transport, I just want to make a plug. I think there was a lot of discussion on school buses and transit buses. I think investments in our public agencies, giving them more resources to figure out how do they electrify their fleet, not at the increment of 10 buses, but at the increment of 100 buses. That's what we need to start thinking about. And I think what that is, it's not just investments in the vehicles and infrastructure, like the physical infrastructure, it's investments in the personnel at these agencies to make this happen. So I'll let that's my statement. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Really appreciate you making all these important points. And we're going to have some time for Q&A with Adrian and our last two panelists. Please do post your questions as what he's suggesting in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to wrangle those. So Adrian will be coming back to you in a little while. I'd like to turn now from overview down. Let's drill down a little bit more. We've got a couple speakers who are going to speak about specific issues. First, we've got Hassan Ikrada of the San Diego Association of Governments. Hassan, if you're with us, thank you. I see you turned your mic on. If you turn your camera on, I'd like to turn the floor to you to tell us a little bit more about what's happening in San Diego.
Actually, the host has turned my camera off, so.
Oh, okay. And let me turn.
Yeah, okay.
Put your camera back on. There you go.
There it is. Thank you very much. Thank you, Duran. Good to see you. Good morning. Happy New Year. It's an honor to be with such an amazing panelist. Greeting to Assemblyman Freeman, Dr. Sperling, Barbeco, and Adrian. Thank you for having me. My name is Hassan Ikrada. I'm the CEO of SANDAG. We are the agency that does transportation planning for 3.3 million San Diegans. And I always enjoy listening to discussion from Assemblymember Freeman, Dr. Sterling, and I always, being in this business for 3 decades, this debate is raging on how do we do to sustain ourselves into the future? How do we do to decarbonize? And I think, yes, zero emission is a great strategy, and we need to work hard to put the infrastructure in place to accommodate that for both passenger and heavy duty vehicles. But we also need to do more. And one thing that wasn't mentioned, in addition to zero emission, in addition to encouraging other mode of transportation, that's pricing. I believe that the system, if the system is not priced right, our policies and strategies are going to go as far. We just adopted in San Diego our what we call the 5 big moves, the regional transportation plan. We're proud of it because it has started a discussion here in San Diego and around the state and around the country about how do we move forward with a system when we know that just saying we're going to build a fixed guideway transit is not enough. And it was mentioned that fixed guideway transit ridership now, because of COVID, is declining, but it was declining before COVID. And you might, when I was in South at SCAG in the other part of Southern California, we did a study why did transit ridership is declining, and the smoking gun in that, based on the researcher from UCLA's work, is people during the prime financing had access and they bought cars. So between 2000 and 2015. And Southern California added 2.3 million people, but they added 2.5 million cars. So access to cars made it more amenable, especially for low-income communities to drive as opposed to taking transit. Transit is going to continue to decline also because we never really thought of transit to be competitive with the automobile. So in our planning here in San Diego, we thought if a transit is not as good or better than the car, I don't think people's going to take it. Choice rider is not going to take it. Right now, pretty much our transit system in San Diego is for transit dependent. 83% of people who ride our transit system don't have any other choice to go from A to B. And it is data that drives our processes. Right now, a trip that takes 30 minutes in the car averages 1 hour and 45 minutes on the bus or the train. That's not the way to do things. So our 5 big moves is about a system of strategies that work together. And like Assemblymember Freeman said, you cannot think of transportation and not link it to land use and think you're going to be effective. Land use and where you build housing and how you build housing and how you build amenities and how you look at active transportation to connect communities is as critical as all the strategies we can do. So I am like Professor Sterling, I'm an optimist. I think in California, we have policies to move us into zero emissions. But unfortunately, we are not moving as fast in implementing those policies or preparing for those policies. We're not moving as fast to put the infrastructure for zero emission vehicles in place. I think in San Diego, we're ahead of the state when it comes to zero emissions, and SANDAG, we're ahead of many agencies in getting money, partnering with the energy department, getting money to build the infrastructure. But we need to do better. We need to do more to be able to do that. So our 5 big moves is really about 5 strategies that fixed guideways transit is part of it, but it's not the main part. It is about mobility hubs where we build housing, where we're investing in transit. It is about active transportation, walkable and bikeable community. It's about what we call the flexible fleet. Dr. Sperling mentioned that a shared electric driverless car might be what we call a flexible fleet and has to be publicly operated and has to be shared. If every one of us is going to be running in a car with a driver, we're just going to add vehicle mile travel. It's a proven with data that Uber and Lyft, when it comes to VMT, is a VMT added company. So mobility as a service is the core of our 5 big moves in San Diego. But what I said in the beginning is we think pricing has to come in. And I know it's politically unpopular. I got, a lot of flack for even discussing it. But we made it part of the regional transportation plan. I think California need to move to a user-based tax. I think the regions need to, wherever alternatives available, and this is really a core in our plan. We divided the region into 12 major corridors. And if a corridor has an alternative to driving that's as good as driving, I think every lane in that corridor should be tolled. I think we should move to a vehicle mile travel based tax. If we are truly serious about impacting the way we behave and the way we drive, if we're serious about making sure that the transportation of the future is going to be an access to a car, not necessarily owning a car. I think something that is a core for our plan is social equity and social justice. In March, we're about to start a pilot, which I'm proud of youth, free youth passes. And we're going to hopefully get to a point where we say, if we want to do this right, we're going to make transit almost fearless, because there is many ways to impact behavior that way. So I know that when Duran comes on the screen, that means I'm out of time. I'm glad to be with the panel, an amazing panel, and I'll be happy to stay and answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hassan. We really appreciate everything you're doing in San Diego and taking the time to be here and share your ideas. Passless transit for students, great idea.
Thank you.
I encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. And I'd like to bring into the conversation Minda Berbeco from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Let's talk a little bit more about what investments are being made here in the Bay Area and what the Air District is doing to try and drive this multimodal approach to solving our mobility problem from a climate perspective and from a pollution perspective. Minda?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to also be talking about investing in sustainable mobility. I'm Minda Berbeco. I'm a manager in the Strategic Incentives Division here at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. There we go. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Air District, just for some folks who aren't familiar with us, where we've been, where we are now, and then where we're going. So the Air District was established in 1955 to address local air pollution, with an understanding that air quality doesn't limit itself to political boundaries, and collectively, counties need to work together to address local air quality issues. At the time of its establishment, the Air District had only about 3 million residents. This was a while ago. And its first efforts were to address trash and waste burning. Now the Air District covers 9 Bay Area counties with 7 million residents. So our mission is to protect and improve public health, air quality, and global climate. My division, the Strategic Incentives Division, annually gives out about $100 million in grants and local funding to support the transition to a cleaner cleaner vehicles and reduce air pollution from mobile sources. So this includes everything from ferries to lawn and garden to trucks and buses. So just to give you a snapshot of the kind of work that we do in strategic incentives, these are just the funds awarded in the past 6 months, and it's a breakdown of them. So this is in millions of dollars. So over $7 million for light duty cars and infrastructure. a very small amount for trucks and buses, so under $1 million. And this is very unusual for us. Usually there's a lot more that we can fund for trucks. And this has to do with the climate impact of, the COVID impact on accessing new trucks right now that we're having, particularly around the ports and manufacturing. And so it's impacted the ability for folks to get trucks and buses, and also it's impacted as a result our ability to fund it. But that impact actually hasn't translated to school buses, because we've been able to fund over $12 million in school buses in our air district just over the past 6 months. Off-road equipment. So this includes things like tractors, both at ports and also agricultural tractors. We've funded about almost $2.5 million. And then marine and rail. So this would be trains, but also ferries and that sort of thing, just under $5 million. And then the last category is trip reduction, which is $2.5 million. And this includes things like last mile commuter connections, sort of like ride shares and shuttles, as well as bikeways that I know several folks have talked about so far. And I just want to talk really briefly about where this funding goes. Again, this is a bit of a snapshot. So it's just the past 6 months. But 86% of the funding has gone to care areas, disadvantaged and low-income communities, and low-income residents. So let's talk about where we've been. So through a series of programs, the Air District has funded a variety of projects across the Bay Area to try to reduce emissions from mobile sources. So my team oversees the on-road work. So that includes trucks, buses, cars, those kinds of things, anything you'd find on a road. And historically, we funded, dating back many years, bikeways and bike parking, commuter connections, which I mentioned before, which include shuttles to get people out of cars, and even smart growth and arterial management projects to change traffic patterns and encourage walking. And these have been effective, and in some cases like bikeways and bike parking, they remain effective in reducing air pollution. But as light-duty cars in the Bay Area become cleaner, and as more people move to zero-emission cars, we've had to update our thinking on how to address air pollution, because though these projects have a lot of value, and as a person on the street, I experience that value every day, in many different ways, their air quality impacts have gone down. So we've had to think about other ways that we can use the money to impact air quality here in the Bay Area. So I'll talk about one of the areas, which is what we're doing right now and what we're thinking about right now. And I'll be highlighting a couple projects and a couple equipment categories that are particularly exciting. So one of those is zero emission school buses. So in 2021, we were able to fund over $14 million. I'm sorry, we contracted for over $14 million for school buses and associated infrastructure. And this was 39 school buses across 9 school districts. And often we're asked, why school buses? So a critique of funding them is that they have low mileage. So how much of an impact can they really have? And I actually really appreciated Ellie Cohen, the CEO, who spoke at the very beginning of Climate Center, talking about the many different ways that we could use EV school buses. I think that's very helpful to think about. But how we think about it here at the Air District is the community that's riding the school buses and the community that's impacted by them. So, and in both cases, it's going to be a sensitive community because it's children. Though most kids spend only about 10% of their time in school buses in a given school day, it can be up to 30% of their air pollution exposure in a day. So research has shown that reducing diesel pollution from school buses also reduces hospital visits and school absences from asthmatic children or children with other respiratory issues. And these are a great fit for EVs. School buses are a great fit for EVs because they can fuel up between trips, and they're typically not long range, and they have a lot of other benefits as well. So, and some of these school buses we're replacing are very, very old. So we replaced one last year from 1984. So these buses travel around residential communities around the Bay Area. So again, they're the most likely of any kind of heavy duty transport to touch everyone in every community. And as it turns out, the Bay Area has one of the cleanest fleets of school buses in the country because of the work that we're doing to transition them away from diesel. And here's an example project that we did, which is the Mount Diablo School District. They replaced 16 diesel school buses with 16 electric buses and associated level 2 chargers. And the diesel buses were from the 1990s, the earliest being 1994. So if you remember that year, the most popular song that year was Ace of Bases, I Saw the Sign. So it's a very long time ago. And this is just like a reminder, when school districts make a commitment to infrastructure and vehicles, it is for the long haul. So these replacement vehicles similarly are going to last a long time. And I know I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to share another project that we're really excited about. And this has to do with what Adrian was talking about earlier, goods movement. So while school buses are out and about right now, heavy duty trucks are more on the leading edge of technology, but this is an enormous opportunity, particularly for port cities of the West Coast where diesel trucks congregate and cause air pollution. So one example that I'll share, and I see Doran, you popped up, so I'll end it right after this one. But this is a demonstration project that we supported, bringing Class 8 zero emission electric trucks, and these are e-Cascadias, to the Bay Area to do typical transport of goods. So these will actually be operated by Cisco, who is a major restaurant food distributor. And I've seen these trucks in person, and aside from their futuristic coloring, they are designed from the driver's perspective, just like diesel trucks. They use a similar cab, everything's in the same location. The idea being that there's a technology challenge, which we've overcome, but also a driver acceptance challenge. And the reality is, if truckers are not gonna choose to drive these trucks, then there's no point in manufacturing. And I will skip ahead to just the end. So I've talked about where we were and where we are now and where we're going. And I just wanted to add a little bit about the challenges. So I talked a little bit about the driver challenges, and I talked about the shortage challenges. And what's interesting, it's not really a technology challenge. We're either there or we're very close. Whether it's ferries or agricultural tractors, but definitely with trucks and buses, what we see is there's concern from folks about getting vehicles and not having appropriate infrastructure available. At the same time, we don't want to have abandoned assets. We don't want to be funding charging stations, which is a big commitment for something like a fleet of trucks, and not have those trucks come to fruition. So those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Minda. And I just want to make sure everybody who's on this call knows the recording will be available, the chat will be available, the contacts and links will be made available, so you can send follow-up questions to all of our speakers today. I do want to invite Adrian and Hassan to join us. We don't have a ton of time. We do have time for a few questions, and we have so many coming in. I just want to make sure we get at least a couple of these questions dealt with. And Adrian, I'm going to start with you. A lot of interest on the Postal Service discussion that you initiated. How close is this done? Is there time to put the brakes on the combustion orders, is what Joyce Clements is asking. And Linda Hutchins-Knowles is back saying, Adrian, who has the power to commit the post office to 100% BEVs? What can we do about it? How close it is to being a reality? How can we stop our mail people, delivery people, from pulling up to our house in gas-powered vehicles?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So they can issue purchase orders until they finalize their environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. There's a waiting period until February 6th. Couple big things. Representative Huffman from up north has been a key leader on this, reaching out to his office, letting folks know that his constituents and others in California are really concerned about this would be important. I think for folks with connections in EPA or the White House, it's important, because the White House can tell the United States Postal Service they need to do a new environmental analysis. The analysis was really broken. Doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent, incomplete, and misleading. So there is opportunity really kind of pushing on the White House, pushing on EPA to intercede, to delay the issue of purchase orders. And so I think there is some time. And then the other thing is, one thing to keep in mind is all the purchase orders won't happen all at once. So I think the key part is we need to fight hard now at this decision point, but also down the road. And I think the other piece is we need better leadership at the Postal Service. So the Senate has a couple candidates to help on the governing board there. So there's a lot there, and it's important for vehicles, for democracy, and a whole host of other issues.
Well, fantastic. Thank you, Adrian, for pointing out these interlocking issues here. You know, politics, policy, infrastructure, they all kind of bind together. As an attorney, you're aware of that. And Hassan, as a planner, you're aware of that too. And again, we have a number of questions, but one question particularly interesting to me, and I'm curious to get your comments. Somebody asked, won't a user fee for roads hurt low-income people? So, I mean, we're all putting equity at the front. So if we want to charge people for using roads, how do we crack that nut without harming the lower income members of our community?
Thank you. And this is a great question. And this is a question that keeps coming up. And I would argue this, that right now we're hurting low income because they're the one who live further, drive older car, and spend more gasoline with the gas tax. A road user charge does not have to be without a mechanism to actually giving back the low-income community. So social equity is a big deal. And I think it is about time to not just check the box, but deal with it from that. So any user system in the future have to have a mechanism to make sure that low-income and minorities are not the one hurt by it. And I think in San Diego, this has been debated quite a bit, and I'm almost afraid to walk in town because of it. But you have to, I mean, they say you can do good planning, but if you have bad pricing, it's not going to work. And I agree with the comment that, yeah, we could hurt low income if we don't do it right. But the technology is there to do a lot of things to make sure that we account for low income who are using the system. But I would also argue that the system we have today is very regressive when it comes to low income.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you very much for those comments. And we just have another minute or two. So I'd just like to wrap with one quick question for you, Minda. Are other air districts implementing similar programs to the air district, to your air district in the Bay Area? Are you operating in isolation? To what extent do you coordinate or collaborate with South Coast or other air districts around the state? What can you say about that?
Yeah, there is a lot of collaboration and there's a lot of learning from each other, which is really nice, and seeing what works in different areas, but also being really cognizant that different air districts have different needs. So South Coast is going to have different needs from the Valley, from us, and so on. And so being able to learn from each other's successes, but then also recognizing, how many ports do we have on the west in our air district versus more inland, and what are their issues that they're dealing with. I saw in the comments some people were also bringing up EV charging in the Valley area, and I think that that's a huge piece in trying to not just get light duty cars, but also heavy duty vehicles as well. And that's something that I think all the air districts are thinking a lot about.
Well, thank you so much. And I really wish we had a lot more time to continue this conversation. However, we've got a couple of really important things we want to share with everybody before we let you go. So I do just want to remind everybody that you can email these folks. They've all agreed to take questions. But before we move on, everyone's like, what can I do about this? How can I be engaged in this? What can we do to accelerate things, move things more quickly? And in order to address that issue and give you something very specific that you can do right here, right now, today, I'd like to invite my colleague Nina onto the screen to talk about our action item for today. Nina?
Hello, everyone. My name is Janina Turner, and I work here at the Climate Center. And I just want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Showing up with us here today is one thing, but like Duran said, taking direct action is how we really make change. So the first action, if you haven't done already, I will drop this in the chat. This is a link to our Climate Safe California platform. So if you haven't endorsed, please do now. And the second action that you can take today is sending a message to your assembly member, urging them to request amendments to Assembly Bill 1218, which is a bill related to the phase out of gas-powered cars. So AB 1218 from Assemblymember McCarty specifies 2035 as the final year that California will register new gasoline-powered vehicles. However, we're asking you to encourage your assembly member to move that deadline up to 2030 in efforts to reach emissions reduction goals at speed and scale. So I'm going to drop another link in the chat where we can connect you with your local assembly member. And we have a pre-written letter that you can send. And all you have to do is fill out your basic information and it will connect you to your local assembly member. And it's really easy, only takes a minute, but because we're wrapping up, I'll let you do that. And I'm going to pass it back to Duran to close us out.
Thank you so much, Nina. This is a great action item that you can take right now to be engaged. Our database will find your assembly member and send it directly to that person. I just want to mention a couple other things before we wrap. First of all, the Climate Center does view these issues comprehensively. Climate Safe California is a comprehensive plan, and part of that plan is not just to reduce emissions, but to sequester emissions through natural means. And we recently released a report. If you haven't seen it, I just dropped that in the chat. There's a link to our report on how California's working lands could absorb up to 1/4 of the state's annual climate emissions. This report, called Setting an Ambitious Climate Goal for California's Working Lands, finds that we can sequester up to 100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, more than previously estimated. And this report will summarize that and give you all of the tools you need to share with others. So we want to thank you all for checking that out. Please do endorse Climate Safe California. Over 1,500 folks already have. You can endorse it as an individual. You can endorse it as an organization. You can do both. And this is a critical part of us helping move our programs forward. Remember, there are more webinars coming up. Our next one on February 24th is on investing in workers for a fossil fuel-free world. And we hope you'll all join us. I would just like to take a moment to sort of review a little bit about what we heard today from all of our great speakers: Assemblymember Friedman, Professor Sperling, Hassan Ikrada, Minda Berbeco, and Adrian Martinez, as well, of course, as our CEO, Ellie Cohen. We learned it's important to join in California, Climate Safe California, so please do so. We also heard from the professor that we're falling behind in EV deployment. As the assembly member pointed out, EVs alone are insufficient. We need a comprehensive approach that prioritizes active transportation, transit, and land use planning to create a new, cleaner California. Adrian talked about focusing on freight and fleets, and especially how we can move to electrifying the postal fleet as being not just low-hanging fruit, but fruit that's literally laying on the ground ready to pick up and eat. So let's move on that. Hassan, thank you for pointing out that transit can only compete with cars if it's better than cars. And how do we reduce time so that people don't say, well, instead of a half hour in my car, I'm going to take an hour and a half on the bus. I'll just take my car. We need to do more, and we need to move out of personal transportation. But in order to do so, we need to make it faster, better, cheaper. And Minda talked about how the Air District is investing in school buses and trucks and making sure that infrastructure and vehicle investments don't outpace each other, so we don't either have buses and trucks without charging infrastructure or charging infrastructure without the vehicles, and also pointed out how COVID and the supply chain has made those issues more of a challenge than ever. So thanks to all of the speakers for all of the great things that you brought to this discussion. And I'd like to thank the 200 plus people who joined us here, all of you who took time out of your busy days and schedules to listen to our great speakers, be part of this conversation, be part of Climate Safe California. For all of you and the organizations that you work for the work you do every day, we thank you deeply. And once again, thanks to all of our sponsors who made this possible, including the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Minda, thanks to you and your team for being part of sponsoring our programs. Remind you all, check into our policy summit. You can register for that. We hope to see you all in April. Of course, February 24th, our next webinar right here in the wonderful world of Zoom. We wish you all good health. We wish you all good work and keep doing what you're doing. Adrian, Hassan, Minda, thank you for turning your cameras back on. Thank you, Ellie, for your great opening comments. And to all of our speakers, our sponsors, our promotional partners, and our attendees, thank you all for being here. The Climate Center wishes you all well, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.